My name is Dr. Cynthia Orozco, and I'm a professor of history and humanities at Eastern New Mexico University in Ruidoso. And my topic today is Adela Sloss-Vento, Mexican-American civil rights activist and feminist. I'd like to talk to you today about Adela Sloss-Vento, one of the most important Mexican-American and Latina civil rights leaders in the United States. Most of us have never heard of Adela Sloss-Vento. She was from San Juan, Texas, in the lower Rio Grande Valley, and lived from the late 1890s to about 1997, 1998. Most of us have never heard of Adela Sloss-Vento, despite the fact that she really is an important person, not only in Texas, but across the nation as a leading Mexican-American civil rights activist. And I'm going to talk to you today about her as a civil rights leader, as a feminist, and as a public intellectual. Moreover, she was also someone quite active in politics and civic engagement. She was a mother, she was a wife, but she was also a very dedicated woman who sought to fight the problems of her day. She was active within two major civil rights movements. She was active in the Mexican-American civil rights movement, which we date to the early 1920s all the way to the early 60s. And then she was also active, a little bit less active because she was older, in the Chicano movement from the late 60s through the late 70s. So I'd first like to talk to you about her as a feminist. But before I do that, I'd like to talk a little bit about the status of the Mexican descent community at the time. If we look at the political status of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in Texas at the time, if we look at the decade of the 1910s, we will see that there was only one Tejano, one person of Mexican descent in the Texas legislature. That person was J.T. Canales, who was a lawyer, who was actually a millionaire, but who nonetheless was referred to as the greaser from Brownsville when he was on the floor of the Texas legislature. In the 1920s through 1950, there were only 3 Tejanos in the Texas state legislature. And in 1969, there were only 12. So we can see the political status of the Mexican descent community was very poor in Texas. And again, recall that we had the poll tax, which existed from around 1902, 1903, all the way to the mid-60s. We can see also this in places like San Antonio, which had its first Mexican descent mayor, Juan Seguin, in the Mexican era or shortly after the Mexican era. But we see that there was not another Mexican-American mayor until Henry Cisneros in the 1970s. We did have Raymond Diaz, who became a mayor in El Paso, but these were very far and few between. We also see that if we're looking at the economic status of the Mexican community, that in 1930, about a third or more than a half, were farm workers. We had a very small middle class, and that middle class started to emerge more so after World War I and much more so after World War II. If we look at the social status of the same community, we see patterns of racial segregation. We are very familiar with those patterns of segregation with regards to the African American, the Black community, less so when it comes down to talking about the Mexican descent community. We know, for example, that those patterns existed across Texas and across the Southwest, and they were particularly vicious when it came to questions of schooling. In 1948, for example, there were 139 school districts that had segregated schools. for Mexican descent children. And typically they would be referred to as the Mexican school. Let me read a passage from an autobiography that my mother wrote from Mercedes, Texas, talking about these patterns of segregation. The Anglo community didn't have anything to do with Mexicans except in things related to business at drugstores, in doctor's offices, in lawyers' offices. The other contact with Mexicans was hiring them to work as maids, cooks, drivers, and other kinds of jobs. Their barrios were nice. Some of their houses were made of brick and wood, and their lawns were kept clean. They had paved streets, electric lights, and running water. Some had cars. The town was divided by the railroad tracks. Most of the Mexicans lived on the north side. The Anglos lived on the south side, away from the warehouses of fruits and vegetables. So we can see, again, those patterns of segregation. Also, if we're looking at the question of education, we will see that in 1930, there were only 250 Spanish surname persons at the University of Texas at Austin, the major institution. In 1946, there were only 114 persons of Mexican descent in all of the Texas colleges. And really, it's not until the 1970s, when financial aid is available, that we really start to see a major shift and improvement in education. Now, looking at Adela Sloss-Vento, as I mentioned, she was definitely a feminist, and she was a feminist both in her writing, but also in her actions. We know really the names of very few feminists that were active before the 1970s. We have here and there, we have some, but again, during what we call the Mexican American Civil Rights movement, again, which lasted from the 20s until the early 60s, we have in Texas the names really of one other major feminist besides Adela Sloss-Vento. And that person was Alice Dickerson Montemayor from Laredo, and she was the first feminist in LULAC. She wrote about women's opportunity in LULAC. She condemned the separate chapters, the segregated chapters that LULAC had from the early 1930s, actually until around the 70s, when it became common to have chapters of LULAC, League of United Latin American Citizens, a major Mexican American civil rights organization founded in 1929. Adela Sloss-Vento never did join LULAC, but she was its major supporter. And she wrote letters and correspondence with the major male LULAC leaders. Again, so Alice Dickerson Montemayor was the first and major feminist in the LULAC. Nonetheless, Adela Sloss-Vento, although she did not join male LULAC chapters, she did not join women-only chapters, she nonetheless wrote about LULAC's significance, and she supported women's cause. For example, she wrote an article in 1934 called "Why There Is No Happiness in Many Latino Homes," condemning male privilege in the home. So this is an example of her writing that shows us that she indeed was a feminist. However, most of her writing was not against sexism, whether it was sexism in LULAC or in US society. Most of her writing really was about racism and class exploitation. And she definitely was a major civil rights leader. For example, in the 1930s, she was involved what we call the Del Rio versus Salvatierra legal case, in which the question of separate Mexican schools was being contested. And we know that she helped raise funds for this legal case. And that was the first challenge, the first class action lawsuit against these separate Mexican schools in Texas. We also know in the early 1940s, several LULAC leaders such as Alonso Perales, Manuel Gonzalez of San Antonio, Perales being from Alice originally, but living in San Antonio. Both of these leaders of LULAC sought to get the Texas legislature to pass anti-discrimination bills that were specific to what they called Caucasian race persons. They were really focused on the Mexican condition and not the Black condition. They sought to get anti-discrimination bills passed at the state legislature. Adela Sloss-Vento could not go there because she was a mother. She was also busy with her husband. Women did not travel very much in those days, but she could write letters, and she wrote letters to Texas legislatures against, or to try to pass these anti-discrimination bills. She also advocated against the Bracero program. Of course, she wanted Mexicans to come over to work and gain wages. However, the problem is that there was super exploitation. Typically, braceros who were Mexicans, officially and legally authorized by the United States government to come into the United States to work from the early 1940s all the way till 1964 or so. The Bracero program was created due to the initial labor shortage caused by World War II. So she advocated against the super exploitation of the braceros, and she argued against so-called cheap labor. She also in the 1950s wrote about a racist pamphlet that had been written by several University of Texas professors and was published by the University of Texas, called The Wetback in the Lower Rio Grande. And again, in the 1950s, this would have been common use to refer to Mexican immigrants as wetbacks. Today, of course, we consider that to be very derogatory, but even the US federal government used that word. That is how disempowered the Mexican descent community was in the 1950s. So she was active in all of these issues in the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement, which came to a decline in the early 60s. But then we see a resurgence of activism with what we call the Chicano Movement. The Chicano Movement was a little different. It was more so organized by young people, often students. They were more overtly proud of their Mexican heritage, and they used more overt, direct methods to get their message across. We also saw the rise and support of the Texas farm workers and the United Farm Workers. And we also saw the rise of the Raza Unida Party, the People's Party, which was an effort by Mexican Americans to get Mexican Americans to run and to support Mexican Americans in politics. Adela Sloss-Vento, again, was older by this time, but she did write letters to the editor and direct letters to members of the Raza Unida Party, also the Texas Farm Workers, United Farm Workers. She also supported a 1967 strike in Ed Couch, Elsa in South Texas, a walkout by students, again, who were arguing for Mexican American Studies curriculum and who did not want to be punished for speaking Spanish on the grounds of schools at that time. She also supported the emerging Chicano studies, which started to emerge around 1970 or so in Texas. And she also was a strong advocate of bilingualism. And again, she supported very overtly pride in the Spanish language. So those were some of the things that she was active in terms of her civil rights activism. Let me read part of an article she wrote for the McAllen Monitor in 1947, and it was titled, "Can we afford cheap labor?" And she said, "No, we cannot afford cheap labor. It does not pay in the long run. Cheap labor ruins the health of workers, of their wives and children. It deprives the children from obtaining an education." So again, this was a discussion really about the Bracero program and the exploitative nature of the Bracero program. With regards to the so-called wetback pamphlet that I had mentioned in the early 1950s, she mentioned that the wetback pamphlet had the following statement, which she as a woman was particularly offended by. About 80% of them, this is a reference to the so-called wetbacks, have lice in their hair. The women especially, they believe that lice helps them to have babies. And so she was one of the few persons that was offended, not just by the racist thoughts and statements by people who were interviewed about the so-called wetbacks in the valley, but she also made reference to the sexism also that was being referenced. Also in the 1960s, as I mentioned, she supported the Elsa Ed Couch walkout, and this is what she had to say. Students protested against discrimination for speaking Spanish on the campus, as well as for their demands to have a course taught in said schools related to the contributions of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the state and region, including factual accounts of the history of the Southwest and culture and history of Mexico. Again, so we see that she is an active supporter of young people, students, who are using more direct methods during the Chicano movement. We also refer to her as a public intellectual. And when we talk about a public intellectual, we're talking about somebody who is a critical commentator and who writes about important issues and really writes for the public, usually in newspapers or other ways in which less educated or non-educated people have greater access to. So we know that she wrote in newspapers from 1927 all the way to 1978. She wrote in both Spanish and English. And what many people are not aware of is that in San Antonio from 1913 to about 1960, there was a major Spanish language newspaper called La Prensa, which means the press, which was really the equivalent of the New York Times for the Spanish-speaking community. And it reached not just in Texas, but into Mexico and across parts in the United States. So she wrote for this newspaper, and she also wrote for English language newspapers in McAllen, Harlingen, and Brownsville, especially after the 1940s. She wrote also more in English. So as I mentioned, she wrote op-eds and she wrote letters to the editor. She responded to one article by a woman who wrote in the Houston Chronicle. This woman wrote the following in 1964. Latins, and she's calling our community Latins. Latins are second-class citizens and for the most part, voluntary illiterates who just don't want to improve themselves. And Adela Sloss-Vento wrote back saying that she was simply stupid and insulting. And again, we had so many of those overt racist attacks on our community, and we needed people like Adela Sloss-Vento to respond to that kind of commentary. We see in Adela Sloss-Vento, nonetheless, a little bit of what I call in the book gendered ambivalence. And what I mean by that is that sometimes she would write in third person, sometimes she would use pseudonyms, she would use different versions of her own name. And more importantly, she really did not credit herself very much. And that's part of why many of us don't know about her. She did not write an autobiography. She did not submit her papers to a professional archive at a university. And really being in the Valley also, fewer people paid attention to her. And I should mention that really perhaps one of her most important contributions was a biography that she wrote. In 1977 or 1978, she wrote a biography, and it's the first biography of Alonso Perales. And Perales was the major founder of LULAC. Now, most of us are unaware of Perales because he died in 1960. And therefore, the folks connected to the Chicano movement were not aware of him. And believe it or not, his archive did not get to a professional academic library until 2009. So you can see that about 50, 60 years had passed before his archive went to a professional library. After his papers got to the library, we had a major conference about him at the University of Houston. But Adela Sloss-Vento knew him. She corresponded with him. She was a colleague, a friend, a co-worker, and she wrote a biography of him. And she included some of his writings. It was an important piece of hers. And I am happy to say that this year, that I have also a major biography of Perales that has been completed and will be published quite shortly. So Perales really, when you look at the broad picture, we really do have to compare him to Martin Luther King. And while, definitely the Black civil rights movement is important, definitely in Texas, we also have to give as much attention to this Mexican-American civil rights movement, which Alonso Perales really did help to initiate. Now, Perales is quite interesting, again, because he was an attorney. He was a soldier in World War I. He worked for the Commerce Department in Washington, D.C., and went on to obtain a law degree in Washington and came back in the late 20s. And really, that's part of how Adela Sloss-Vento got started, is that she met Alonso Perales in the Valley, and that is how she connected to the Mexican-American civil rights movement, by connecting to Perales and connecting to the LULAC organization and other civil rights efforts. I also want to say that Adela Sloss-Vento was very active in politics, and she's interesting because she was not an elite person. She never ran for office. She was not an elected official, but she was very active in politics in the Valley. We know that she supported US presidential candidates, FDR, Truman, Kennedy, LBJ, and Carter. And she wrote these presidents. And again, you think about, this is a Mexican-American woman from South Texas who feels confident enough in herself to understand that she has the right and perhaps obligation to write US presidents. And again, think about today, we know that probably less than 10% of all Americans ever write a public official. And she's doing this throughout the various decades. We also know that she was involved in a key 1948 Senate race where she was not supporting Lloyd Bentsen, who went on to win that important race. She was active in local, county, and state candidacies in Texas. And also around 1940 or so, she actually created what we call the Citizens Political Club. And its purpose was really to inform Mexican Americans about the poll tax and about their right to vote. And she also supported the Raza Unida Party. Again, she really was mostly a Democrat, but nonetheless, she supported the Raza Unida Party. What's also interesting about her is because she lived in the Valley and lived along the border, she was also a transnational political person. And she also wrote presidents in Mexico. So again, she suggested that it was not her right to tell Mexico what to do. She believed Mexico should be sovereign, but she had ideas that she shared with presidents of Mexico. So if we look at Adela Sloss-Vento, we see definitely a wise Latina woman. We also see that a woman who was a wife, a mother, and also a person who began to work in the late 40s as a warden in a jail, in the Hidalgo County Jail, as somebody who was working. We see that she found ways to be active, although almost all of her efforts were with men and not women. And we definitely see that she really was not a member of LULAC, nor was she a member of Ladies LULAC, but she was in a league of her own. And that was Adela Sloss-Vento. Adela Sloss-Vento was born in 1901 and died in 1998. Another thing that is unusual about Adela Sloss-Vento is that she actually helped me get started as a young historian. In 1978 or so, I met her son, who was head of Chicano studies at UT Austin, and I was a work study student. He is the person who introduced me to her. By that time, I was already doing original research on the history of LULAC, and that is how I came to meet her. This is a picture of Adela Sloss-Vento. She graduated in 1927. She was actually a little bit older because she had to work to help her family. Her parents had been divorced, and so she had to financially assist the family. So she was already in her mid-20s or so when she graduated from high school. Again, high school graduation for a Mexican-American woman was highly unusual at the time. I talk about her as a civil rights leader, a public intellectual, a Democrat in the United States, and Democrat small d for Mexico, because she advocated for Mexico and its sovereignty and its right to solve its problems. Also, she was a feminist. We do need to talk about the racial context to talk about her. Here we see a sign. What many people are unaware of is that really from the 1890s on up until the 60s or so, it would have been common to see signs, racist signs, that would have said things like no Mexicans allowed, or no dogs allowed, no Negroes, no Mexicans. And again, we are so familiar with these signs with regards to our Black population, but we encountered those same signs. This is one from Dallas in the early 40s. This sign, which says "We serve whites only, no Spanish or Mexicans," was photographed by Russell Lee in the 40s in San Antonio. And I always tell folks we see ignorance on a number of levels. Number one, it's a racist statement. Number two, whites is misspelled here with a possessive. And number three, any person who did not allow Mexican descent people into their restaurants or hotels was losing business, so they were not business smart. Again, we also have to talk about the gendered context, and what is particularly unique in the Mexican descent population in Texas is that while the NAACP, for example, was both biracial and integrated by gender, in the Mexican descent experience, we have severe gender segregation. So if you look at this picture, LULAC is actually the second major organization. There was a previous one out of San Antonio called the Sons of America, founded in 1921, and which had 7 chapters in South Texas by 1927. But in 1929, members of all those organizations came together. The Sons of America obviously emphasized gender because it said sons or hijos. Hijos could be children, but they translated as men. And so when LULAC was formed in 1929, and this picture is in Corpus, you will see that there is not a single woman in this picture. Adela Sloss-Vento, Adela Sloss at the time, because she was not yet married, would have known about this convention, but she was not invited to attend because she was a woman. Here we have a picture of the staff from La Prensa newspaper in San Antonio in 1929. If you look carefully, you will see there is not a single woman in this picture. What's also impressive is the number of staff persons here, staff men, at this newspaper, again, letting us know that La Prensa was such an important newspaper. Very impressive, but not a single woman journalist. Also, if we look at those folks who were attorneys, and again, this is all, these pictures are emphasizing the male nature of activism. Here we see Mexican-American attorneys. This is in 1954. This is after a major Supreme Court case, Hernandez versus Texas has been won. There is not a single Mexican-American woman attorney here. I believe the first one is in the mid-50s, a woman from Raymondville, but she is not involved with these men. Here is the place that Adela Sloss-Vento worked in the late 40s for about 20 years or so. And again, the fellow seated in the middle, seated with glasses, that is her husband, Pedro Vento. Pedro Vento was what I would call a modern man, meaning that he was comfortable with his wife as an activist, as a writer. He did not try to impede her from her activism, particularly her writing activism. Again, she did work as a matron at the jail. And again, you can see that generally there's a male context, although she worked with women, braceras, who were also in the jail. If we look across the decades, we can see some photos that we have of her activism. Moving into the 20s next, we can see here's a picture that we have of her mother and her half-sisters, because her mother did remarry. So Adela Sloss did help her mother. So she had some financial responsibilities. That is part of why it took her so long to get her high school degree. But again, it's a quite rare situation to graduate as a Mexican-American woman in the 20s. This is a picture of Adela Sloss-Vento, and she's the first row seated, the last person on the right side. Again, this is actually a racially mixed group, so this is also unusual. And she received letters from some of her fellow students, and they couldn't figure out how a Mexican was graduating with them, and how was it that she was so smart. This is a picture of a newspaper that came from the Adela Sloss archive. Again, when I was a young student, as a sophomore, I began conducting original research, and I met Adela Sloss-Vento. I went to her home in Edinburgh, and she shared some of her materials with me. This is a 1927 conference that the Order Sons of America had in order to talk about how they were going to unite different organizations. And they also took up the issue of should they allow Mexican citizens, Mexican immigrants to join. And they decided against permitting Mexican immigrants, and they wanted to focus on US citizenship. And Adela Sloss-Vento knew about this convention, but she was not invited. She was a woman, but she did help to record it. Again, here we have the 2 years later, the 1929 organizing of all of these various Mexican-American male groups to begin a major civil rights campaign, the LULAC organization. Here we have a picture of Alonso Perales, who truly is the major founder of LULAC. And again, a very supportive man for Adela Sloss-Vento. He used to compliment her all the time for her activism. Here we have another co-activist of Adela Sloss-Vento, J. Lou Saenz, who was a teacher. He would often get fired because he would raise hell about the segregated schools and the inferior nature of the Mexican schools. Also wrote a major diary, now published, about Mexican Americans in World War I. Here we have another major friend and co-activist of Adela Sloss-Vento. This is J.T. Canales, who, as I mentioned, was the only Tejano legislator in Texas in the 1910s, a very active writer. Most of his writings are not particularly well known. J.T. Canales is also the person who initiated an investigation of the Texas Rangers in the late 1910s for major murders of Mexicans in South Texas. Again, a major friend of Adela Sloss-Vento. Moving into the 1930s next, here we have the very first annual LULAC conference in 1930 in Alice. And if you look at this photo, you can actually see that there are women. And so we know that officially women are not yet members of LULAC, but they are there as both auxiliary members. And then later, a few years later, they do create an authorized ladies LULAC, separate councils for women. Here's a picture of Alice Dickerson Montemayor, the first major feminist in LULAC. She was quite active for a few years. Before World War II, she had some personal issues and exited LULAC, but she wrote very overtly about the machismo in the LULAC organization. But again, mostly women were organized separately. Here's a picture of Adela Sloss-Vento's husband, Pedro Vento, again, who was in charge of the Hidalgo County Jail. And then her two children, she had a son, Arnoldo and Irma. Both of them went on to get PhDs. And that's part of why Adela Sloss-Vento worked, was so that they could fund the college education of their children. Here's a picture of one of Alonso Perales's book, In Defense of the Mi Raza. So it included many of his writings between 1919 and the 1930s. Again, Adela Sloss-Vento, most of her life praised Alonso Perales more than any other person. She sought to give him his due, and that is why she wrote a book about him. Moving on to the 40s next, and to the 50s next. Here we have a picture of Adela Sloss-Vento in the 1950s, a much more mature woman. And interestingly enough, the only group of women that she seemed to have organized with were the women in her church. We don't have a lot of information about there. Her archives have very, very little about her work with women in the church. Here we have another photo of a more mature Adela Sloss-Vento. Here we have a picture in the 1950s of what was called Operation a Wetback from the jail that she worked at, where Mexican immigrants are being returned to Mexico. And here we have a publication that was written after a major conference in Mission, Texas, which responded to what was considered the racist wetback pamphlet, which the University of Texas published. And she was at that convention, and she taped some of the recordings of that event that are located at the J.T. Canales papers in Kingsville. She did not speak, but again, she acted as a documentarian at that event. Moving on to the 60s next. Here we have a newspaper photo of the Chicano student walkout at Couch Elsa, again, which she supported. And again, most of her activism was through writing. Moving on to the 70s next. Here we have actually my very favorite photo of Adela Sloss-Vento standing in her yard outside of her home in Edinburgh. And I love this photo because she looks like a typical, ordinary, domesticated woman from the 70s. And you can't tell that she is a major Latina civil rights feminist from this photo. Here is a picture of the cover of the flap of her book, Alonso Perales, His Struggle for the Rights of the Mexican American. Again, this book is a very rare document today. I suppose that probably only a couple of hundred were ever produced. She was much elder by this time, so she did not go on a book tour. There were maybe one or two reviews of her book in newspapers. Academics mostly were unaware of her book or ignored it. And here we have a picture again of Perales. This is the first major biography of Perales. And this is what the cover underneath the flap looked like, underneath the jacket. Moving on to the 80s. Her son, as I mentioned, was a professor of Spanish and Chicano studies. This is a mural that was done in the Midwest. And if you look on the top left corner, you can see a picture of her. He probably informed the artist about her, and therefore she appears there. Otherwise, we have very little public recognition of Adela Sloss-Vento. Moving into the 90s next. And our last photo that we have is of Governor Ann Richards. And I include Governor Ann Richards here because the very last political act that I am aware of by Adela Sloss-Vento was a letter to Governor Ann Richards congratulating her for her victory. Now, we actually do not have the letter from Adela Sloss-Vento to Governor Richards, but what we have is a response by Governor Richards to Adela Sloss-Vento. And in that letter, Governor Richards thanks Adela Sloss-Vento for observing that Richards has a vision for Texas. And when I read that letter, I sat and chuckled because I knew that the vision that Governor Richards thought was hers was that originally of Adela Sloss-Vento. Thank you for being here today.